The end of the Trae Young era could be upon us in Atlanta, and even though in the past we've done this before, where Trae's been a little bit unhappy, or they've had to rebuild the team around him, or there's been trade rumors really for a handful of years prior to this, this feels different. A scenario is unfolding with the Atlanta Hawks where it could be made very clear by the end of the season that it makes way more sense for Young and the Hawks to go their separate ways. So coming into this year, this was a massive season for the Hawks. There was a ton of excitement and anticipation around a team that added Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Kristaps Porzingis in the offseason, that had young pieces like Zachary Risacher coming off his rookie year as the first overall pick, Jalen Johnson, who was hurt for most of last season, Dyson Daniels coming off of a breakout year, and then of course Trae Young at the center of it. And they had built this team around Trae Young with youth and athleticism and defense and shooting that made so much sense around him. And in a weaker Eastern Conference, there was a real thought that the Hawks could be a top 4 team in the East, potentially competing for conference finals, or even in the craziest scenario, an NBA finals berth, which also put a lot of pressure on Trae Young himself. Because if you were going to build not necessarily the perfect team, but the theoretical, really good version of a team around Trae Young, what the Hawks built in the offseason is exactly what it would look like. Length, defense, shooting, some secondary playmaking, but still most of that burden falls on Trae Young. He's the engine of your offense, and you have a ton of depth that just does everything else. The problem is the season did not get off to a great start in Atlanta. Guys like Dyson Daniels and Zachary Risacher that they were really counting on were disappointing to start the year, and then Trae Young gets hurt. And so you're looking at this as a potential disaster season for the Hawks. Slow start, then your best player, or in theory at least, your best player is going to be missing a ton of time, and what was supposed to be this really impactful season is just completely gone. And traditionally, the Hawks have just not performed well without Trae Young, especially offensively. He does so much for them. He is almost single-handedly the engine of the offense, or at least has been over the last couple years in Atlanta. So he goes down with an injury, and everybody kind of starts panicking about the Hawks. However, in the game since Trae Young got hurt, the Hawks are 6-2. They've won a bunch of games on the road. They're 4th in the league in defensive rating, 14th in offensive rating, and suddenly you look around and start to wonder, is this team actually better off without Trae Young? Because the obvious benefit of Trae Young not being out there is just having better defensive personnel, and the Hawks have a bunch of guys they can throw out there that are going to be really good on defense, especially when you don't have to worry about how bad Trae Young himself is on defense all the time. And they have enough on offense with more on-ball opportunities for Dyson Daniels. Jalen Johnson continuing to grow and develop, where the offense doesn't fall off a cliff the way that it has in the past, either when Trae Young doesn't play due to injury or is just off the floor in general. Now, I'm not trying to make the case that the Hawks are genuinely better without Trae Young. Him playing versus him not playing is obviously an overall positive for the Hawks. He's a very good player. However, that's not the entirety of the thought process and the decision-making process here, because when you go back to the offseason, the Hawks had an opportunity to commit to Trae Young as the focal point of their team long-term. He was extension eligible. He has a player option in the summer of 2026, and they went through the offseason and did not sign him to an extension. So the question now becomes in Atlanta, given this recent stretch of play, given Trae Young being out with the injury, the question is not, are they better without Trae Young? The question is, are they better off spending elsewhere and potentially moving on from Trae Young at the deadline, or letting him walk in free agency if he opts out of his player option, simply because that money they could give Trae Young, $50-60 million a year, would be better spent elsewhere. And to be fair, I'm not necessarily a big Trae Young guy. I've said a lot in the past that I don't really believe in building around him as someone that is maybe the worst defensive player in the entire league, but it's not just me that's saying this. The fact that the Hawks chose not to commit to him in the offseason, they had an opportunity to sign him to an extension and they did not do so, tells me a lot about what they think about Trae Young. And not just that they didn't sign the extension, but that they couldn't come to an agreement on some level of value. Now, that might say more about Trae Young's asks potentially in a contract. Maybe he's looking for the absolute max contract, and Atlanta just doesn't see that level of value in him, and it's difficult to negotiate with stars that see themselves as max guys, and maybe you don't see him on that level. I'm sure there's a lot of details to it, but if the Hawks really 100% believe that the best version of their team is with Trae Young at the center of it, they would have signed him to the extension and they didn't. And we all know what the negatives are, right? He's one of, if not the worst defensive player in the entire league. He's going to have the ball in his hands a ton. He's never as good of a three-point shooter as it really seems like he thinks that he is. But there's also a lot of really good things about having Trae Young on your team, because in many ways, he is single-handedly one of the best focal point offensive players you can have in the Eastern Conference. As Trae Young is out there, you've got decent shooting and a little bit of secondary playmaking. You're going to have one of the 8 or 9 best offenses in the entire league. That has just been proven true throughout his career, given his playmaking and his scoring, his skill set in the pick and roll, all that stuff. I'm not trying to say that Trae Young is a bad player. There are definitely positives here. But given this stretch of play, there are 2 scenarios developing in Atlanta, both of which are very interesting to me. One, he comes back, they have a really good season. Maybe they do finish with one of the top seeds in the East. They have a nice playoff run, and at that point, they do sign him to some kind of contract in the offseason. I expect him to opt out of that player option and then get a new deal with Atlanta. And that deal probably is not going to be the full max, given that they didn't do that in the offseason, but it's going to be a big number. They find a middle ground between the full max and something that's reasonable, and they go ahead and move forward with Trae Young at the center of the team. And the team that they built for this year is the team that they have long-term. Ricochet, Daniels, Jalen Johnson, Trae Young, and then whatever happens in the front court, whether it be Okongwu, obviously KP you still have to figure out, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Luke Kennard, the team this year, that's your team moving forward. You figure out the contract stuff with Trae Young. The other scenario is the Hawks continue to play well. They realize that they're not particularly interested in giving Trae Young a giant contract in the offseason. Trae Young and his camp realize that, and we're looking at the possibility of him getting traded at the deadline or just leaving in free agency, giving the Hawks all of this flexibility to build around Jalen Johnson, Ricochet, Dyson Daniels, and all of the other pieces here. And that second scenario is really intriguing to me for a few reasons. One, there's been some indication that the Hawks have quietly shopped Trae Young over the last couple of seasons, and one of the reasons why they didn't actually make the move probably would be they didn't like the offers they were getting in exchange, and part of that is probably due to some of the contract issues the Hawks are having with him as well, where they can't figure out what number they want to sign him to. Other teams don't want to be, set up with a bad contract long term. And so kind of my read on that situation has been, if the Hawks had gotten a deal in the last handful of years that they really liked in exchange for Trae Young, a bunch of first-round picks, something along those lines, they would have taken the deal. And so given that they haven't, and you have this impending contract situation, I'd be very, very interested to see what the actual market is for Trae Young, because the Hawks are not going to just trade him for like a first-round pick. They want some significant amount of stuff. And again, it seems like that offer just hasn't come to fruition. The other part of this that makes this extremely interesting for Atlanta is in a scenario in which you get some level of value for Trae Young. This is also a team that owns the New Orleans Pelicans first-round pick unprotected this season. The Pelicans, who just fired their coach, who look like one of the worst teams in the West. You could have a scenario here where, with or without Trae Young, either way, you're adding a top 5 pick to this roster. And you can think of that in 2 different ways. One, that's an awesome cost-controlled asset, a really, really great player, top 5 pick, and you add that to this core you already have. Or you trade Trae Young for value, and then whoever you get with this top pick becomes that focal point guy that you build around alongside someone like Jalen Johnson. There are just a lot of different directions that things could go here in Atlanta. And given the excitement level, the anticipation for the season, it's interesting that we've already reached this point and there's so many different variables to this situation. Obviously, this is something we're going to continue to keep an eye on. And in case you were curious, if it was totally up to me, I would explore trading Trae Young. I would explore options that involve Trae Young not being on the Atlanta Hawks beyond this season, whether that be letting him walk in free agency, whether that be trying to find a trade partner, because I believe that Jalen Johnson is the best player on the team, and that's the guy you should be building around. That's also a guy that's on a much more reasonable contract moving forward compared to what Trae Young, I presume, is going to sign in Atlanta or elsewhere. And having that Pelicans pick, having the opportunity to put another young guy alongside all of the young talent that they have in Atlanta, to me, is the much more promising path moving forward. You can be a good team this year, you can still get a really high pick, and you can open up the flexibility by trading Trae Young, not dealing with the contract, potentially getting value. If it was totally 100% up to me, that's what I would do.